I froze when I heard my son say during a family dinner, "One day this house will belong to me." He spoke as if the decision had already been made while my daughter-in-law stood beside him with a knowing smile. I didn't argue or lose my temper. I simply stayed quiet, remembered every word they said, and began uncovering the truth behind the plan they thought I would never discover. Thank you for joining me here on Dad's Revenge Stories. Your support means the world to me. Where in the world are you watching from today? Tell me your city or country in the comments. Please note, storylines contain creative elements for dramatic storytelling. Resemblances are purely coincidental, but the message inside is meant for you. I was up before 5 that morning, same as every morning for the past 40 years. Old habits from the shop floor. Don't die just because you hand in your badge. I pulled on my work pants, laced up my boots at the kitchen table, and poured coffee into the same cracked mug Margaret had been threatening to throw away since 2004. She never did. And now I'd never let anyone else throw it away either. The farmhouse was quiet, in the way only old houses know how to be quiet, not empty, but settled, like the walls had heard enough over the years that they didn't need to comment anymore. I walked through the kitchen, past the spot where the linoleum still showed the scuff mark from the refrigerator. We moved in together back in 2009, and out through the side door into the pre-dawn dark. 4 acres. That's what I had. 4 acres of flat Iowa ground, just outside Cedar Falls, with a gravel driveway that needed regrading every spring and a fence line along the east side that leaned a little worse each winter. The farmhouse itself was built in 1962. 3 bedrooms, a covered porch that sagged on the left end, and a kitchen window that faced east, so Margaret could watch the sunrise while she drank her tea. I bought it in the spring of 2009 for $112,000. I paid cash. Not because I was wealthy, I was about as far from wealthy as a man could get while still owning land, but because I had spent 41 years as a diesel mechanic for Hartwell Freight out of Cedar Rapids, and I had put money away every single month since my first paycheck in 1978. My father told me once that a working man's only real savings account was discipline. I believed him. I still do. The place was rough when we got it. The roof had 2 soft spots that I found the first time it rained, which was 3 days after closing. The electrical panel was a fire hazard dressed up as a fuse box. The back bedroom smelled like something had lived in the wall and lost the argument. Margaret walked through it the first time with her arms crossed and her jaw set, which was her version of falling in love with something. "We can fix all of this," she said. "It'll take years," I told her. "So?" She turned around and looked at me with those eyes that always made me feel like she could see the exact square footage of my soul. "We've got years, Harold." We did. We had 14 good ones in that house before her heart gave out. In the spring of 2021, 14 years of weekends, on ladders of driving to the hardware store in Waterloo, of me doing the heavy work and Margaret doing the detail work because her hands were steadier than mine, and she knew it. We replaced the roof together in 2011, one section at a time, starting with the worst corner over the back bedroom. I pulled permits for everything, every single job, because that's what a man does when he's doing things right. I kept the permits in a gray accordion folder in the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom. Next to the permits sat the receipts, lumber roofing nails, insulation pipe fittings, electrical wire. Next to the receipts sat the inspection cards, each one signed off by the county inspector with a date stamp. And next to those sat the photographs. Margaret was the one who started the photographs. She had one of those old point-and-shoot digital cameras that she carried around like a reporter on a crime scene. Every time we finished a section of work, she'd make me stand in front of it with my tools, and she'd take a picture. "For the record," she always said, I used to roll my eyes. She'd take the picture anyway. After she passed, I kept taking them myself. It felt like continuing a conversation she'd started. Me and the camera and whatever piece of this house I was working on that weekend. The dock light I rewired over the back shed in the summer of 2022. The new water heater in 2023. The fence posts I reset along the north property line last spring, every one of them plumb and level, because Margaret always said a straight fence was a sign of a man who respected his own work. My neighbor Walt Greer used to lean on that fence and watch me work on Saturday mornings. Walt was 70 years old and had lived next door since before I bought the place. He had the slow, deliberate way of talking that men develop when they've spent most of their lives outdoors and learned that most things don't need to be said quickly. "You keep records like a lawyer," he told me once, watching me photograph a newly poured concrete pad behind the shed. "I keep records like a mechanic," I said. "When something breaks, you need to know what was there before." Walt nodded at that. He understood the logic. In our line of work, his was agricultural equipment. Repair mine was long-haul diesel documentation, wasn't paperwork. It was protection. It was the difference between knowing what happened and guessing. By the time I retired in 2019, the farmhouse had been transformed from a tired listing old wreck into something I was genuinely proud of. The porch was level. The roof was solid. The electrical panel was modern and properly grounded, every circuit labeled in my own handwriting. The spare bedroom that used to smell like something's last stand now had fresh drywall and a braided rug Margaret had picked out from a shop in Waterloo 3 weeks before she got sick. And under the oak tree in the backyard, the big one 80 years old, if it was a day with roots that had cracked the concrete path twice, no matter how many times I repoured it, that was where I'd put Margaret's ashes. Not in a cemetery. Here. On our land. Under a tree she used to sit beneath on summer evenings with a glass of sweet tea and a library book, her feet bare in the grass. I visited her every morning. Stood there for a few minutes before the day got started. Sometimes I talked. Sometimes I just stood. Either way, she knew I was there. I kept everything. Every receipt. Every permit. Every photograph. Every inspection card. My son Derek used to tease me about it when he was young, called me the most boring man in Iowa because I filed things instead of throwing them away. Margaret used to defend me. "Your father isn't boring," she'd tell him. "He's thorough. There's a difference." Standing in the pre-dawn quiet that September morning, coffee going cold in my hand, I looked out at those 4 acres and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride exactly. More like unease. The kind that settles in your chest. When an engine starts making a sound. It didn't make yesterday, not loud enough to call a breakdown, but wrong enough that you can't unknow it once you've heard it. I never thought I'd need any of it to prove the house was mine. Labor Day fell on a Monday that year, the way it always does, and the weather cooperated for once. 72 degrees, a light wind coming off the fields to the west. The kind of Iowa afternoon that makes you forget about the 6 months of gray that bookend it on either side. I'd fired up the grill by noon. Walt came over around 1 with a 6-pack of Grain Belt and a bag of ice, which was his version of bringing flowers, and we stood in the driveway, talking about nothing in particular, the way men our age do when life is treating them decently enough not to complain about. Derek and Vanessa arrived at 2:30 in a silver SUV that cost more than my first 3 trucks combined. I heard the tires on the gravel before I saw them. Derek stepped out in a polo shirt with the collar up, the kind of casual that takes effort, and gave me a handshake that had been practiced into something between a greeting and a performance. He was 39 years old, and he had his mother's eyes and my stubbornness, And for most of his life, those two things had balanced each other out well enough. Vanessa came around from the passenger side in sunglasses and a smile that never quite reached the part of a face where smiles are supposed to mean something. Sophie tumbled out of the back seat before the car fully stopped. She was 14 and moved through the world the way 14-year-olds do, like the laws of physics were suggestions. She sprinted across the yard, wrapped both arms around my waist, and pressed her face into my chest hard enough that I had to step back to keep my footing. "Grandpa," she said into my shirt, "I missed you so much it's actually embarrassing." I laughed for the first time in a week. "Missed you too, Bug. You're getting tall." She pulled back and looked up at me with an expression of absolute offense. "I've been the same height since 7th grade and you know it." "I know. I just like watching you get mad." She punched my arm and ran off toward Walt, who she'd known since she was 4 and treated like a second grandfather. I watched her go and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. The afternoon moved the way good afternoons do, slowly without agenda. I grilled burgers and corn. Derek told a story about a client in Des Moines that he'd already told at Easter, but I let him tell it again because it made him happy and it cost me nothing. He mentioned a business partner named Craig Holloway twice in the telling a name. I filed away the same way I filed everything, without knowing yet why it would matter. Vanessa walked the perimeter of the property twice with her sunglasses on, moving with the deliberate pace of someone taking inventory rather than enjoying a walk. I noticed that. Filed it away the way I file things. Quietly, without comment. It was around 4 o'clock when it happened. Sophie had gone inside to use the bathroom, and Walt had drifted back toward his own yard to check on something, and it was just me and Derek and Vanessa standing near the oak tree at the back of the property. Derek had a beer in his hand and was looking at the house the way I sometimes caught him looking at it, not with affection, but with the particular focus of a man doing arithmetic in his head. "This place is going to be mine someday, Dad," he said. He said it the way you'd comment on the weather. Casual. Like it was already an established fact that I simply hadn't been informed of yet. I looked at him. "That's so." He smiled and took a drink of his beer. "Come on. You know what I mean. Eventually. When you're ready to slow down." I was 68 years old, and I'd been slowing down since 2019. But that wasn't what bothered me. What bothered me was the word eventually, the way he used it, like a destination that had already been agreed upon by everyone except me. Before I could answer, Vanessa lowered her sunglasses and looked out at the 4 acres with an expression I can only describe as satisfaction. "Sooner than you think," she said. She wasn't talking to me. She was talking to Derek. And Derek didn't look surprised. He looked the way a man looks when someone says out loud the thing he's been thinking privately, and the relief of it outweighs the caution it should have triggered. He caught himself a half-second later and glanced at me, and for just a moment, his smile flickered like a bulb with a bad connection. "She means when you're ready," he said. "No rush, Dad." My chest tightened with a pressure I recognized from the shop floor, the feeling of hearing something wrong before you can name what it is. Like a diesel engine running 3 RPMs too fast. Not broken yet, but not right either. Sophie came back outside and grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the fence to show me something she'd found, a hawk feather, long and brown-tipped, caught in the wire. We stood there together looking at it while the adults talked behind us, and she leaned against my arm the way she had since she was small, and I thought about Margaret, who used to say that children were the only honest people left in any family. I cooked the rest of the afternoon on autopilot. Shook Derek's hand at the car. Hugged Sophie so long she started squirming. Watched their taillights disappear down the gravel drive and blend into the evening traffic on the county road. Walt appeared at the fence. "Good visit to..." "Fine," I said. He looked at me for a moment. With the slow, reading kind of look he'd developed over 70 years of knowing when men meant what they said and when they didn't. Then he went inside without pushing it, because that's what good neighbors do. I stood in the yard until it was fully dark. Walked back to the oak tree. Stood there with my hands in my pockets and looked up at the sky through the branches. "Something's off, Margaret," I said quietly. "I can feel it the same way I used to feel a bad engine before it seized." The tree didn't answer. It never did. But standing there always helped me think. 3 weeks later, my bank called. There are phone calls, you remember. The way you remember accidents, not because of what was said, but because of the silence that comes right after the moment. Your brain catches up to what your ears just heard. Donna Kessler introduced herself twice. That was the first sign. People who deliver straightforward news don't introduce themselves twice. They say their name once, state their business, and move on. When a person says their name, pauses, then says it again, like they're making sure you've had time to prepare. What they're really doing is giving you a half-second to brace yourself. "Mr. Bennett, this is Donna Kessler calling from First Heartland Bank. I'm in the mortgage review department." A pause. "Donna Kessler, I want to make sure I'm speaking with Harold J. Bennett, the property owner at 4418 Sycamore Creek Road, Cedar Falls." "That's me," I said. I was standing at the kitchen counter eating a bowl of oatmeal. I set the spoon down. "Mr. Bennett, I'm calling because we've flagged an irregularity on your property record during a routine audit. There's a recorded mortgage instrument against your property. The principal amount is $120,000. Our records show it was filed with the county in March of this year." I stood very still. In 41 years of diesel mechanics, I learned that when something goes wrong inside an engine, the worst thing you can do is start pulling parts before you understand what you're hearing. So I did what I always did. I listened first. "I don't have a second mortgage," I said. "I paid off my original note in 2019. The property has been free and clear for 6 years. "Yes, sir." Her voice was careful the way people are careful around something fragile. "That's why we're calling. This is a separate instrument. A private mortgage. Filed March 14th. The lender of record is listed as a third party, not a financial institution. And the borrower on the document is listed as you." The oatmeal went cold on the counter. I didn't notice until an hour later. I asked her to read me the name of the lender. She did. It wasn't a bank. It wasn't a company. It was a name I recognized, but I won't get into that yet because at that moment in the kitchen, what mattered wasn't the name. What mattered was that somewhere in the public record of Black Hawk County, Iowa, there was a legal document that claimed I had borrowed $120,000 against my own home, and I had never signed it, never discussed it, never received a single dollar of it. "I'll need a copy of that document," I said. "I can email you what we have," Donna said, "but I'd recommend going directly to the county recorder's office for a certified copy. That's the official record. What we have is a scanned version." I thanked her. She started to say something else, something about the bank's process and timelines, but I was already writing the address of the Black Hawk County Courthouse on the notepad I kept by the phone. Old habit. Write everything down. I drove 35 minutes to Waterloo that same morning. The county recorder's office was on the second floor of the courthouse, a room that smelled like toner cartridges and decades of filed paperwork. The clerk behind the counter was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she pulled up my property record with the efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times and stopped being surprised by any of it. She printed the full instrument and slid it across the counter without comment. I read it standing. "Real estate mortgage. Borrower, Harold J. Bennett. Property address 4418 Sycamore Creek Road, Cedar Falls, Iowa. Principal amount $120,000. Date of instrument: March 14th, 2025. And at the bottom a signature line with my name printed beneath it. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. I have signed my name approximately 40,000 times in my life. Paychecks, work orders, inspection cards, the deed to this property, Christmas cards, the form at the hospital when Margaret was admitted for the last time. A man's signature is not just a name. It is a physical habit, a motion the hand makes without thinking, worn into muscle memory, the way a gear wears into its housing after years of turning. My signature has a specific hook on the capital H, a small upward curl at the end of the second stroke that I picked up from my father and never bothered to change. It is not something I decided to do. It is something my hand does automatically every single time without exception. The signature on that document had no hook. The H was smooth, finished, careful, drawn by someone who had studied my name, but had never once watched my hand move. It was a good forgery, good enough to fool a county clerk on a busy Tuesday in March. But it was not my signature, not even close. I asked for 2 sets of certified copies. The clerk stamped each page without asking why, which I appreciated. I paid the $14 fee in cash and folded the copies into the inside pocket of my jacket. In the parking lot, I sat in my truck for a long time. The engine ticked as it cooled. A pigeon walked across the hood, looked at me through the windshield with the complete indifference that pigeons have perfected over centuries, and walked off the other side. $120,000. Filed in March. 3 months before Labor Day. Before Derek's comment about the house. Before Vanessa's smile. They hadn't slipped up at that cookout. They had been reading from a script that was already on file with the county. My hands were steady on the steering wheel. I noticed that specifically, that they were steady because I expected them not to be. What I felt wasn't panic. It was colder than panic. It was the specific clarity that comes when a problem you've been sensing finally shows itself, and you realize the problem is worse than you feared, but also for the first time visible. And visible problems can be solved. I didn't call Derek. Not yet. First, I needed to know how deep this went. I called Derek that same evening. Not because I was ready to confront him, I wasn't, not by a long stretch, but because 40 years of diagnostics taught me that before you pull anything apart, you listen to it, hon. You let the engine tell you what it knows. So I dialed his number, sat down at the kitchen table with my notepad open and my pen uncapped, and I listened. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he wasn't avoiding me. That was interesting. "Hey, Dad." Relaxed. Easy. The voice of a man who had not spent the afternoon sitting in a courthouse parking lot, staring at his own forged signature. "Derek," I said. "I got a call from the bank today. Something about a mortgage on the property. $120,000. You know anything about that?" 2 seconds of silence. Not long enough to be guilt, just long enough to be calculation. "Oh, that," he said, and the casualness of those 2 words hit me like a wrench dropped on concrete. "Dad, you remember. You signed off on that back in March, to help me out with the investment account restructuring. You said it was fine." My jaw tightened so hard my back teeth ached. "I didn't sign anything in March, Derek. Dad." His voice shifted softer now with a layer of patient concern that made my skin crawl. "You've been forgetting things. It's not a big deal. It happens. I was there. You signed it at the kitchen table. Mom's blue pen, the one you still keep in the drawer." He knew about the blue pen, Margaret's pen, the one with the chewed cap that I hadn't thrown away because throwing it away felt like erasing something. He knew about it, which meant he'd been in this house looking at things, cataloging things, learning the small details that would make a lie sound true. "I want to see the original document," I said. My voice came out flat and even, which surprised me. "Dad, I'll dig it up. Don't stress yourself out over paperwork." A pause, then brighter. Hey, are you coming for Thanksgiving? Vanessa's talking about doing the whole thing this year, the full spread." I told him I'd think about it. Hung up. Wrote every word of that conversation in my notepad. Date, time, his exact phrasing. The detail about the blue pen. All of it. Then I went to the living room and looked at the small black camera mounted in the upper corner above the bookshelf. I installed that camera in the fall of 2022 after a break-in 2 streets over left Walt's shed cleaned out overnight. It was a basic unit motion-activated saved footage to a memory card. Nothing fancy. I checked it maybe twice a year and mostly forgot about it. The lens was dusty. The indicator light had stopped blinking sometime around last Christmas, which made me assume the battery was dead, which made me stop thinking about it entirely. I pulled a step stool from the kitchen, climbed up, and popped the camera off its mount. Turned it over in my hands. The memory card was still seated. I carried it to the spare bedroom where I kept the old laptop Margaret had used for her quilting patterns, and I slid the card into the reader slot and waited. The footage was there, 63 video files date-stamped and sequential stretching back 14 months. The camera had been running the whole time on its internal battery motion-triggered silent and forgotten in its dusty corner. I started with August. Scrolled through timestamps until I found the ones recorded between midnight and 4 in the morning, because that's when the house should have been empty and still. Most files were nothing a shadow from a passing car, the cat I'd been feeding on the porch. But on August 19th, at 2:17 in the morning, the motion sensor caught something that made my chest seize up like a cold engine trying to turn over. Derek. Standing in front of my filing cabinet in the spare bedroom. He was wearing a dark jacket, and he'd brought a small flashlight, the kind that clips to a keychain. He worked methodically, top drawer first, then middle, then bottom, lifting folders, checking labels, replacing each one with the careful deliberateness of a man who needed things to look undisturbed. He spent 11 minutes at that cabinet. I know because the timestamp ran in the lower corner of the screen. I wasn't looking for something to steal. He was looking for something to use, or more precisely, something to make sure I couldn't use. I was checking what I had, taking inventory of my defenses before the fight he already knew was coming. My hands were shaking by the time the footage ended. Not from fear. From something that I can only describe as grief with a hard edge, the specific pain of watching someone you love prove themselves capable of something you'd hoped they weren't. I sat in that spare bedroom for a long time, with the laptop open, and Derek's face frozen on the screen, that keychain flashlight in his hand, my filing cabinet open in front of him. Margaret had been right about a lot of things in her life. One of them was a thing she said to me shortly after Derek was born, when I held him for the first time, and made some comment about how he'd grow up to be a good man. She'd looked at me with that clear-eyed honesty she always had, and said, "He'll grow up to be whatever we teach him to value, Harold. Let's make sure we teach him right." I hadn't done enough of that. I didn't know where the failure was exactly, and I suspected I never would. But sitting in that room at 9:30 at night, with my son's face on a screen and a forged mortgage in my inside jacket pocket, I understood that the question of where it went wrong was a luxury for later. Right now, I had work to do. I ejected the memory card and locked it in the fireproof box under the bed where I kept the property deed. Then I went to the kitchen, poured 2 fingers of bourbon I didn't drink, and stared at the wall until the clock hit 10. I called Pastor Jim Caldwell the next morning. Cedar Falls First Methodist sat at the end of Birchwood Avenue, a white clapboard building with a green door and a parking lot that needed resurfacing 3 years ago and still did. Pastor Jim Caldwell had been leading that congregation for 19 years, which meant he had buried more people than he could count and counseled more marriages than he cared to remember. And somewhere in between, he had developed the particular stillness of a man who has heard every variety of human trouble and stopped being surprised by any of it. I called him at 7:15 in the morning. He answered on the first ring. "Harold," he said like he'd been expecting me. "Jim, you have time this morning. Back door's unlocked, coffee's on." That was the thing about Pastor Jim. He didn't ask what it was about. He didn't say, "Call my secretary or let's find a time next week." He just said the back door was unlocked and the coffee was on because in 19 years of ministry, he had learned that when a man calls at 7:15 in the morning, the time to talk is now. I drove over without eating breakfast. The church was empty at that hour, the way old buildings get empty, not hollow, but resting like they're gathering themselves for the day ahead. Jim was in the small office off the fellowship hall, sitting behind a desk that was buried under folders and paperback books and 3 coffee mugs in various stages of use. He was 67 years old, a big man gone soft at the edges with white hair. He kept meaning to cut, and reading glasses perpetually pushed up on his forehead. He poured me a coffee without asking how I took it, because he'd known me for 11 years, and he knew I took it black, and he sat back in his chair and waited. I told him everything, all of it straight through the way I'd have described a mechanical problem to another mechanic, start to finish. No editorializing, just the sequence of events in the order they happened. The Labor Day cookout, Vanessa's smile, the bank call, the courthouse, the forged signature, the camera footage, Derek standing at my filing cabinet at 2 in the morning with a keychain flashlight. Jim didn't interrupt, didn't wince, didn't make the face people make when they're deciding how to respond before you've finished talking. He just listened with his hands folded on his stomach and his eyes steady on mine. And when I finally stopped talking, the room was quiet enough that I could hear the furnace ticking on in the basement. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, picked up one of the coffee mugs, found it empty, and set it back down. "Harold," he said, "how many times have you thought about calling Derek and telling him what you know?" "Every day," I said. 3-4 times a day. "And what stops you?" I thought about it honestly. "I don't know what he'll do if he knows I know. He might destroy something I haven't found yet." Jim nodded slowly. "So your instinct is right. You're not staying quiet because you're afraid. You're staying quiet because you're being careful." He paused. "There's a difference. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise, including yourself." He stood up and walked to the window that looked out onto the side yard, where an old oak tree, smaller than mine younger, was dropping the last of its October leaves onto the grass. He stood there with his coffee mug looking at the tree, and when he spoke again, his voice had the particular weight it got during his better sermons. "Write it down, Harold. Write everything down. Every conversation, every date, every word you remember. God doesn't need you to shout to be heard. He just needs you not to forget." He turned from the window and looked at me directly. And neither does a judge. I drove home with both hands on the wheel, and my mind already organizing itself into columns the way it used to when I was troubleshooting a complex engine fault, symptoms on one side, probable causes on the other, tests needed in the middle. At the kitchen table, I opened a fresh composition notebook. Not the accordion folder, not the laptop. A composition notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover that cost $1.19 at the drugstore on 5th Street. The same kind I'd been using for work logs since 1981. On the first page, I wrote the date, October 2nd, 2025, and then I started from the beginning. Labor Day. Every word Derek said at the grill, every word Vanessa said under the oak tree, the exact phrasing of Donna Kessler's phone call, the address of the recording in the courthouse file, the timestamp on the camera footage, Derek's explanation about the blue pen. All of it written out in my regular handwriting, each entry dated and timed to the best of my memory. I wrote for 3 hours without stopping. When I finally put the pen down, my hand ached in the joints the way it did after a long day of torque work, and the first 17 pages of the notebook were full. I made a fresh pot of coffee and sat back down and read what I'd written from the beginning. It held together. It was coherent. It was as best as I could reconstruct it. True and truth written down in sequence with dates and specific language has a weight that memory alone never quite achieves. Margaret used to say I was the most methodical man she'd ever loved, which she meant as both a compliment and a complaint, depending on the day. Standing in the kitchen with that composition notebook under my arm, I thought she might have been preparing me for this longer than either of us knew. The next Sunday, Derek brought Vanessa and Sophie out for dinner. And the Sunday after that, Vanessa invited her friends. Margaret had a saying about guests. She believed that the way a person treated someone else's home told you everything you needed to know about how they saw the world. A good guest asked where to put their coat. A bad guest rearranged your furniture and called it helping. Vanessa fell into a third category that Margaret hadn't lived long enough to name. The Saturday evening started simply enough. Vanessa had called earlier in the week to say she was having a few friends up from Des Moines, colleagues from her marketing firm, people she wanted to impress, and could they use the farmhouse? Not could we visit Dad. Could they use the farmhouse? Like borrowing a conference room. I said yes because I didn't yet have a reason to say no that I could explain out loud, and because saying no to Vanessa had always produced a specific kind of friction that Derek spent days smoothing over afterward. By 4 in the afternoon, she had rearranged the living room. My reading chair, the big green one I'd had since 2003, the one with the armrest worn smooth on the right side where I'd rested my elbow through 10,000 evenings, was pushed into the corner behind the door like a piece of furniture that had been demoted. The coffee table had been covered with a linen runner I'd never seen before, candles on the mantel, fresh flowers in a vase on the kitchen counter, which would have been lovely, except they were sitting in Margaret's blue ceramic pitcher, the one with the small chip on the handle that I'd never fixed, because Margaret said imperfect things had more character than perfect ones. I was in the garage at 5 when the guests started arriving. I could hear their cars on the clipped sound of city shoes on the porch steps. Voices that carried the particular brightness of people performing enjoyment. I had the carburetor from Walt's pushmower spread across my workbench. He'd asked me to look at it weeks ago, and I'd been putting it off, so I stayed with it. The garage was my space in a way the living room no longer felt like mine that evening. At 6:30, I came inside to wash my hands. I'd been working with a parts cleaner that smelled like solvent, and my forearms had a thin film of grease that the garage sink hadn't fully handled, and my work pants had a streak of oil along the right thigh that had been there since Thursday. I came through the side door into the kitchen, which was the most direct route to the downstairs bathroom, and I walked straight into the edge of Vanessa's evening. There were 6 of them in the living room. Women in their late 30s and 40s dressed in the way that people dress when they want to look like they didn't try very hard, but absolutely did. They were holding wine glasses and laughing at something, and the laughter stopped in that specific staggered way that laughter stops when something unexpected enters the room. Vanessa was standing near the fireplace. She turned when she heard the side door and something moved across her face. Not quite embarrassment, not quite annoyance, something sharper than both gone in less than a second. "Oh," she said brightly to her guests rather than to me. "Don't mind him. He just wanders in and out. You know how it is." She smiled with all her teeth and tilted her wineglass slightly in my direction, a gesture that managed to be both an introduction and a dismissal at the same time. One of the women, blonde, angular, the kind of tired that expensive things can't fix, glanced at me and then back at Vanessa with a small understanding smile. "Is that the handyman?" she asked, not quietly enough. Vanessa laughed. It was a real laugh. That was the part that hit me in the sternum like a fist, that she actually found it funny. "Something like that," she said. Then lower, but not low enough, "He just kind of lingers, like the hired help that forgot to leave." The women laughed. Not cruelly. They didn't know, didn't know whose house they were standing in, didn't know that the green chair in the corner had been moved there to make room for their wine and their weekend shoes. They laughed because Vanessa laughed, and because that's what people do in rooms where one person controls the temperature. I dried my hands on the dish towel by the sink. My face felt very hot and very still at the same time, the way metal gets when it's been in the sun, warm to the touch but not moving. I walked to the bathroom, washed my hands properly with soap, and looked at myself in the mirror for a moment. 68 years old. 41 years of honest work. My name on the deed of this house since 2009. I walked back through the kitchen, past the women in the living room, without looking at them, and out the side door into the cooling evening air. In the garage, I found my composition notebook on the workbench where I'd left it that morning. I opened it to the next clean page, uncapped my pen, and wrote the date and time at the top. Then I wrote exactly what Vanessa had said. Every word. The question the blonde woman had asked. The laugh. The phrase that was still sitting in my chest like a splinter I couldn't reach. Like the hired help that forgot to leave. I wrote it down in quotation marks, with a notation that there were 6 witnesses present, none of whose names I knew. I noted that Derek had not been in the room. I noted the time, 6:34, and the approximate number of guests, and the fact that the interaction had occurred in the main living room of my own property. Then I closed the notebook and picked up Walt's carburetor and went back to work because the carburetor needed fixing, and standing in a dark garage feeling sorry for myself was not going to fix it. I worked until 8. The guests' cars left around 9. By 10, the farmhouse was quiet again. But when I walked back inside, Margaret's blue pitcher was sitting on the edge of the counter at an angle, and one of the fresh flowers had fallen onto the floor, and nobody had picked it up. I set the pitcher back in its proper place, put the flower in the trash, and turned off the kitchen light. 2 weeks later, I came home from a doctor's appointment, and Margaret's chair was gone. The chair had been in the left corner of the living room for 14 years. It was a wingback. Burgundy upholstery gone slightly faded on the armrests from years of afternoon sun coming through the west window. Margaret had found it at an estate sale in Marion in the spring of 2010. The second year we owned the farmhouse, and she had made me load it into the truck bed myself because she said the estate sale people were charging too much for delivery, and she wasn't going to pay a $20 convenience fee on principle. I'd carried it up the porch steps alone while she directed from behind me, and I'd set it in that corner, and she had sat down in it, immediately crossed her ankles and said, "Perfect, don't ever move it." I never did. After she passed that corner of the room, became the one thing in the house I couldn't bring myself to change. Not the chair, not the side table beside it, not the small reading lamp with the cream shade that she'd ordered from a catalog in 2015. I dusted them every week. I replaced the lamp bulb when it burned out, same wattage, same color temperature, because Margaret had chosen that particular quality of light, and I saw no reason to choose differently. I came home from my appointment at the cardiologist's office in Waterloo at 2:15 on a Thursday afternoon in late October. The appointment had gone fine. Blood pressure, manageable, nothing alarming. Come back in 6 months. I drove home in reasonable spirits, which in the context of the last several weeks meant simply that my hands weren't shaking. I came through the front door and looked at the left corner of the living room. The chair was gone. The side table was gone. The lamp was gone. The corner was empty in the way that only a space can be empty when something that belonged there has been deliberately removed, not vacant, but amputated. For a moment, I simply stood in the doorway, with my coat still on and my keys in my hand, and looked at that corner. My brain kept sending my eyes back to it, the way a tongue goes back to a missing tooth, not because it expects to find something different, but because it cannot stop checking. Vanessa came out of the kitchen holding a dish towel. She had apparently been here while I was at the doctor, which I had not known and had not agreed to. "Oh, Harold, good timing," she said, with the bright efficiency of a woman who has already decided how a conversation is going to go. I had a local hauling crew come by this morning to clear it out. That old chair and the table were taking up so much space in that corner. I thought a floor lamp would open it up so much better. I actually found one online that would be perfect. Very clean lines, very modern. I can order it if you want. I looked at her. My coat was still on. My keys were still in my hand. And that was Margaret's chair, I said. I know, and it's been sitting there for years. She folded the dish towel over her forearm the way people fold things when they're trying to look reasonable. Harold, I know it's hard, but holding on to everything doesn't help you move forward. Derek and I just want you to have a fresh space, something that feels new. My throat closed up so hard and so fast that I couldn't have spoken even if I'd known what to say. 14 years I had dusted that chair. 14 years I had replaced that lamp bulb. 14 years I had walked past that corner every single morning and felt for just a moment that the house still held something of the woman who had made it worth living in. Gone. To the Salvation Army. While I was having my blood pressure checked, I turned around and walked back out the front door. I heard Vanessa say something behind me, something about dinner, something about being practical, but the words didn't assemble into meaning. I walked across the yard and through the side gate and across the back field to the oak tree. I stood there with both hands pressed flat against the bark. The bark was rough and cold and absolutely real, and I needed something real under my hands right then. My shoulders were shaking. I could feel it the way you feel something in your body that you can't stop once it starts, not sobs. Just this deep, involuntary trembling that started in my chest and moved outward until my whole frame was involved in it. I hadn't cried since the morning after Margaret died, standing in this same spot, telling her what the doctor had said the night before, apologizing for not being there at the exact moment. That had been 4 years ago. I had not cried since. I was crying now. Not the way men cry in movies controlled and cinematic. The way men actually cry when no one is watching, ugly, effortful jaw locked the sound of it, more like something breaking than something releasing. Walt's voice came from the other side of the fence. Harold? I didn't turn around. Give me a minute, Walt. Take all the minutes you need. A pause. Then the creak of his gate opening and his footsteps on the dry grass. And then he was simply there beside me, his big weathered hands in his jacket pockets, looking up at the oak tree the same way I was. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't tell me it was going to be okay. He didn't say anything, which was exactly right, because there was nothing to say. And Walt had lived long enough to know the difference between a silence that needs filling and one that needs to be left alone. We stood under that tree for 40 minutes. The light went from gold to gray to nearly dark. At some point, Walt put his hand briefly on my shoulder, one firm press, then gone, and that was enough. When I finally spoke, my voice came out rougher than I expected. She picked that chair herself, Walt. Drove 40 minutes to Marion to get it. Walt nodded once. You want me to find out where it went? I thought about it for a long moment. No, I said. I just needed someone to know. He nodded again. We walked back across the field together in the dark, and at the gate he turned toward his own yard without ceremony, and I went inside and sat at the kitchen table in my coat for a long time. The next morning I called Arthur Simmons. Arthur Simmons's office was on the third floor of a building on Commercial Street in Waterloo that had been a department store in the 1940s and still had the bones of one high ceilings, wide windows, floors that announced every footstep with a particular authority. The elevator was original to the building and moved with the slow deliberateness of something that had decided long ago that it was not going to be rushed. I took the stairs. His name was on the door in plain black letters. No firm name, no list of specialties, no inspirational quote stenciled on the frosted glass, the way some offices had started doing. Just Arthur Simmons, attorney at law, and a door handle worn smooth from decades of people who needed something fixed. The receptionist, a younger man with a precise part in his hair, showed me in without ceremony. Arthur was already at his desk, and he stood when I entered, which was the first thing I noticed about him. Not because it was remarkable standing. When someone enters a room is basic courtesy, but because it was increasingly rare, and the men who still did it tended to be the kind of men who meant what they said. I was 55, trim, with the kind of careful stillness that comes not from passivity but from practice. He wore a dark suit with no tie, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and a mechanical pencil behind his right ear that he would reach for before I'd finished my second sentence. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "sit down. Tell me what you have." I set the accordion folder on his desk. He unzipped it without comment and began reading. I had organized everything chronologically: the certified copy of the mortgage instrument from the county recorder, the bank statement showing the property had been free and clear since 2019, the pages from my composition notebook covering Labor Day through the previous week. He read with the mechanical pencil in his right hand, not writing, just holding it the way some people hold a pen when they think, like an anchor for their attention. He read for 12 minutes without speaking. I counted because I had nothing else to do with my hands, and the clock on his wall had a second hand. When he finished, he set the pencil on the desk, took his glasses off his forehead, and cleaned them with a small cloth from his breast pocket. He did all of this slowly and deliberately, and I understood that this was not stalling. This was how he moved between receiving information and responding to it. He gave the information the respect of a pause. "All right," he said. "First things first. A forged mortgage instrument is void from the moment it's created. That's not an opinion that's settled law in Iowa and every other state in this country. Void means it has no legal effect. It cannot transfer any interest in your property. It cannot be enforced." He set his glasses back on. "However, void does not mean invisible. That instrument is sitting in the public record of Black Hawk County right now, and it will keep sitting there until a court orders it removed. That's what we're going to do." I explained the process in plain language, which I appreciated. In Iowa, when someone records a false document against your property, you can file what's called a quiet title action, a lawsuit asking the court to declare the instrument void and strike it from the public record. The name comes from the idea of quieting a cloud on your title, meaning clearing up any dispute or false claim that's muddying the legal waters around your ownership. It is a civil proceeding, not a criminal one, though the underlying conduct, forging a recorded instrument, is a separate matter entirely. The forgery itself is a felony under Iowa code, Arthur said. That's for the district attorney to decide whether to pursue. What we're doing is the civil side getting your title cleaned up and pursuing damages for what this has cost you. What kind of damages? I asked. Slander of title. When someone records a false document against your property and it causes you financial harm. A blocked refinance, a frozen sale, legal fees, you can sue for those losses. Given what you've described, we have a strong basis. He tapped the folder. What I need to know is what documentation you have to prove the $120,000 never existed. Bank records, 7 years minimum. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and produced a second envelope. 7 years of statements from my 2 accounts at First Heartland Bank, printed that morning at the branch on 4th Street. He took them without comment and paged through them for 3 minutes. No deposit of that size, he said. Not as a lump, not in installments, not at all. No, I said, because it never happened. He looked at me over the top of his glasses. Mr. Bennett, you can forge a signature. You cannot forge the absence of money. He picked up the mechanical pencil again. Now, the notary, Gerald Moss. That stamp on the acknowledgement page is the soft spot in their case. A notary is legally required to personally witness the signature they're certifying. If Moss stamped that document without you standing in front of him, he violated his commission and potentially his criminal statutes as well. Men protect their licenses. He wrote Moss's name on his notepad. We'll start there. He asked one more question before I stood to leave. He asked it without looking up from his notepad, which told me he'd been holding it for a while. Mr. Bennett, Derek's name is going to be on the defendant line of this complaint. You understand that? I know whose name it is, I said. He looked up then. Studied me for a moment, the way men study something they're not sure they can trust yet. Then he nodded once and picked up his phone. Our first move wasn't the courthouse. It was a letter to the Iowa Notary Commission. Gerald Moss had been a commissioned notary in Black Hawk County for 22 years. He ran a small tax preparation and insurance storefront on the east side of Waterloo. The kind of office that smells like carpet cleaner and old coffee with a plastic sign in the window that listed his services in descending order of importance. He also played cards on Friday evenings with a rotating group of men that included, among others, my son Derek. Arthur explained the mechanics of the letter before he sent it. In Iowa, a notary public is a state-commissioned official whose specific legal function is to verify the identity of a person signing a document and to certify under penalty of law that the signature was made in the notary's physical presence. That certification, the notary block, the stamp, the signature is what gives a recorded document its legal weight. Without it, a private mortgage instrument cannot be filed with the county recorder. With it, a forged document can walk straight into the public record and sit there for months before anyone notices. The letter Arthur sent to the Iowa Notary Commission was 4 paragraphs long. It described the recorded instrument, identified Gerald Moss as the certifying notary, and requested confirmation of the circumstances under which the notarization had occurred, specifically the date, the location, and what form of identification had been presented by the signer. The letter was polite, precise, and copied to Gerald Moss directly. Arthur told me that last detail mattered more than the first 3 paragraphs combined. A letter to the commission is a formal inquiry, Arthur said when he called to tell me it had gone out. A copy to Moss is a notification that the clock has started. Men who've held a clean commission for 22 years do not want to explain themselves to a state board. They call before the board has a chance to call them. Gerald Moss called Arthur's office 4 days later. I was not in the room for that conversation, but Arthur relayed it to me the same afternoon in a phone call that he prefaced by saying, "Harold, I want you to hear this exactly as it happened, so I'm going to read from my notes." Gerald had not been hostile. He had not lawyered up immediately, which Arthur said was itself informative. He had called in the mid-morning, asked for Arthur directly, and when Arthur picked up, Gerald had said without preamble that he wanted to explain the situation before it went any further. Derek had come to Gerald's office on a Tuesday afternoon in March. He had brought a folder of documents, which he described as family paperwork, an estate planning matter. He said routine stuff everyone had already signed. Gerald had known Derek for 6 years through the card group. He trusted him. He looked at the documents, saw the signature lines already filled in, saw Harold J. Bennett typed at the bottom of the mortgage instrument, and he stamped it. He stamped it without calling me, without asking for identification, without verifying my presence in any form, because Derek had told him everyone had already signed, and Gerald had taken that at face value. He had never met me. Not once in his entire life. When Arthur finished reading, I sat with that for a moment. 22 years of doing it right. Hundreds of documents, thousands of stamps, a commission that had never had a mark against it. And then one Tuesday afternoon in March, a man he played cards with on Fridays brought him a folder and said everyone had already signed, and Gerald Moss decided that was good enough. "He knows what he did," Arthur said. "He didn't try to minimize it. He asked what we needed from him. What we needed was an affidavit, a sworn, notarized statement, notarized by someone else. Arthur had specified, which Gerald apparently found grimly appropriate, attesting that Gerald Moss had stamped the acknowledgement block on the mortgage instrument, dated March 14th, without Harold J. Bennett, present without verifying Harold J. Bennett's identity, and solely on the representation of Derek Bennett, that the signature was legitimate. We also needed his account of the specific circumstances, Derek's exact words, the time of day, the location, what the folder looked like. Gerald signed the affidavit within the week. Arthur said his hand was steady when he signed it, which he took as a sign that the man was genuinely relieved to be on the right side of something for a change. We also needed my alibi for March 14th. The mortgage instrument claimed I had appeared before Gerald Moss and signed in his presence. I had not been within 40 miles of his office that day. I had been in Chicago visiting my brother Ray for 3 days while he recovered from a knee replacement. I had the Amtrak tickets, the confirmation email from the hotel on North Michigan Avenue, and 3 receipts from restaurants Ray and I had eaten at during the visit, one of them a diner on Wabash where I had paid cash, but the receipt had the date and time printed at the top, 11:47 in the morning, which was within the 2-hour window the instrument claimed I had been in Waterloo. I brought all of it to Arthur's office in a manila envelope. He spread it across his desk and looked at it with the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head and liking the result. "The affidavit puts Derek in Moss's office with the documents," he said. "The alibi puts you somewhere else entirely on the day the document claims you signed. Together they established that the signature was not yours and that the notarization was fraudulent." He stacked the papers carefully. "We have the forgery. We have the absence of money. Now I want his voice." He meant Derek's voice, saying it out loud, in a recording. 2 weeks after Gerald Moss signed his affidavit, a letter from Derek's lawyer arrived at my house. I have received a lot of mail in 68 years. Bills and birthday cards. A letter from the Army in the spring of 1975 that changed the next 2 years of my life. The deed to this property in 2009, which I read 4 times at the kitchen table before I believed it was real. The death certificate for Margaret, which arrived in a plain white envelope 3 weeks after she passed, and which I have never been able to bring myself to file in the accordion folder with everything else. But I had never in 68 years received a letter from my own son's lawyer. It came on a Tuesday. The return address was a firm in Des Moines I had never heard of, two names hyphenated together on cream-colored stationery that cost more per sheet than my lunch. I opened it at the kitchen counter with a butter knife because I was making a sandwich when the mail came, and the knife was already in my hand. The letter was one page. It referenced the promissory note and mortgage instrument recorded against my property in March. It stated that I had failed to make any payments on the outstanding principal of $120,000. It informed me that my failure to cure this default by December 31st would leave their client, a phrase that turned my son into a stranger in 4 syllables, no choice but to pursue all available legal remedies up to and including initiation of foreclosure proceedings under the recorded mortgage. Foreclosure on my own home, initiated by my own son. By New Year's Eve, I set the letter on the counter next to my sandwich. I finished making the sandwich. I ate it standing up, reading the letter a second time, because the first time through, I had been reading it the way you read something you cannot quite believe, and the second time I needed to read it the way you read something you are going to have to act on. Then I put the letter in the accordion folder in the front section, right behind the certified copy of the forged mortgage, because a demand letter built on a forged instrument is not a threat. It is evidence with a postmark and a law firm's letterhead. I called Arthur. He was not surprised. "They're trying to force a settlement before you have time to build your case," he said. "The deadline is psychological. December 31st sounds urgent. It isn't. We filed our quiet title complaint 10 days ago. The lawsuit exists whether they send letters or not." He paused. "Put it in the folder." "Already done," I said. "Good man." I went to find the letter that same afternoon, not the demand letter, but a different one. 3 weeks earlier, while Derek and Vanessa were at the farmhouse for a Sunday dinner, I had cooked and served and cleaned up after I had helped Derek with his coat at the door when they were leaving. It was a habit from raising him. You hold the coat, the kid puts his arms in, 39 years hadn't broken me of it. His jacket was a heavy canvas thing with deep pockets, and when I lifted it from the hook, something rectangular slid out of the left pocket and landed face up on the floor. I picked it up before Derek turned around. It was a confirmation sheet from a place called Meadow Glen Senior Living in Ames, Iowa. A deposit receipt. 1 month's deposit on a studio apartment, paid by Derek Bennett, designated resident Harold J. Bennett. The deposit date was October 15th, 3 weeks before I had found it on my floor. I had photographed it with my phone before. Derek reached the door, slipped it back into his pocket, and helped him into his jacket without a word. He drove away without knowing I had seen it. I had not slept well that night, and I had not told Arthur about it yet, because I was still deciding what it meant, whether it meant Derek was planning ahead for a future I might genuinely need, whether it meant something else entirely. Standing in the kitchen with the demand letter fresh in the folder, I understood what it meant. They had not just come for the house. They had already decided where I was going to live after they took it. A studio apartment in Ames picked and deposited on in October while I was still eating Sunday dinners I cooked for them. I sat down at the kitchen table and called my brother Ray in Nebraska. Ray picked up on the third ring. He was 72 years old and had the slow, rocky voice of a man who had smoked for 30 years and quit for 20, and still carried both in his chest. He listened without interrupting, while I told him about the demand letter and the deposit receipt, and when I finished, he was quiet for long enough that I checked the phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Harold," he said finally, "you remember that summer Derek was 15, the Henderson's bicycle?" "I remember," I said. "He took that bike and sold it to a kid at school, and told you the Hendersons gave it to him. You believed him for 3 weeks until Carol Henderson asked you about it at church." Ray coughed once, deep and dry. "This isn't new, brother. This is the same thing, just bigger." I hadn't thought about the Henderson bicycle in 20 years. The memory of it came back with a specific clarity. Derek at 15, standing in the kitchen. With that particular expression, he had the one that was almost convincing, the one that would have worked on anyone who wasn't paying close attention. "He's coming for Christmas," I said. "I know," Ray said. "So am I." I started to tell him he didn't have to make the drive from Nebraska in December. He cut me off before I finished the sentence. "Harold, I'll be there." I hung up and sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time, with my hands flat on the table. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to come down over the 4 acres, light and dry, covering the grass in a thin white sheet that made everything look clean and temporary at the same time. My granddaughter Sophie had been leaving things in my toolbox since she was 6 years old. It started the summer. Margaret was sick when Sophie was too young to understand what was happening in the house, but old enough to sense that something was wrong, and that the adults around her were not going to explain it. She had come out to the garage one Saturday morning while I was working, watched me for a while without speaking, and then quietly placed a folded piece of paper between my socket wrench and the tray of drill bits. I found it an hour later. It was a drawing of the two of us standing in front of the farmhouse, her in a red dress she'd had at the time, me considerably taller than I actually am, both of us with enormous smiles that took up most of our faces. She had been putting things in that toolbox ever since. A stick of gum the previous Easter. A photograph from her school trip to the state capitol last spring. Small things. The kind of things you leave for someone when you want them to know you were thinking about them, but you don't quite have the words for it yet. I found the letter on a Wednesday morning in early December. I was in the garage looking for a 1/2-inch socket. I had apparently lent to Walt sometime in October and not gotten back. And I opened the top tray of the toolbox, and there it was, a folded piece of notebook paper, the kind with the torn spiral edge tucked between the socket wrench and the tray of drill bits in the exact same spot she had used when she was 6. I unfolded it standing there in the cold garage with my reading glasses still in the house. Her handwriting was careful and slightly uneven, the way teenage handwriting gets when someone is trying to make it look more adult than it naturally is. 6 words printed in blue ink, underlined once. "Grandpa, don't sign anything. Please." I read it 3 times. My chest tightened with a feeling I did not have an immediate name for, not quite pain, not quite pride, something that sat between the two and pressed outward in all directions at once. She was 14 years old. She had heard something or seen something, or put together pieces that the adults around her thought they had hidden well enough. And she had not known what to do with what she knew, so she had done the only thing she could think of. She had put it in the toolbox. I folded the letter carefully along its original creases and put it in the breast pocket of my flannel shirt, directly over my heart, which I recognized as a sentimental thing to do and did not care. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Outside the window, the December light was flat and gray, the kind that makes everything look like a photograph of itself. I thought about Sophie at 14, sitting in her bedroom in Des Moines, listening through walls to conversations she was not meant to hear, writing 6 words on a piece of notebook paper and driving 2 hours to Cedar Falls to put them in an old man's toolbox, because she did not know what else to do. Walt knocked on the side door at 10:30 the way he did most mornings in winter when neither of us had anywhere particular to be. I poured him a coffee and showed him the letter without explaining it. He read it, set it on the table, and looked at me over the rim of his mug. "Smart kid," he said. "She gets it from her grandmother," I said. Walt nodded once. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small black USB drive, the kind that clips to a keychain. He set it on the table between us. "Speaking of smart," he said, "you remember 2 weeks ago I showed you how to back up your phone photos?" I remembered. Walt had spent an entire Saturday afternoon walking me through it on his own laptop with the patience of a man who understood that the pace of the lesson needed to match the pace of the student, and not the other way around. I had backed up everything, 14 years of farmhouse photographs, every image on my phone copied onto that drive and verified file by file before Walt would let me call it done. "Everything's on there," Walt said. "All 14 years. "I know," I said. "You made me check twice. I made you check 3 times. He picked up his coffee. "But that's not why I brought it over this morning." He set the mug down and looked at me steadily. "2 weeks ago, after we finished this backup, you left your phone on my kitchen counter while you used the bathroom. You were gone maybe 4 minutes. He paused. "While you were gone, your phone lit up. Text message. From Sophie." I looked at him. "I didn't read it," he said immediately. "The screen just showed the preview. It said, and I'm telling you exactly what I saw. It said found something on Dad's phone, sending you the screenshots. And then it went dark again." He slid the USB drive an inch closer to me. "When I plugged your phone in to finish the backup, those screenshots came through with everything else. 12 images. I didn't look at them, but they're on the drive." I picked up the USB drive. It was light in my hand, barely there, the kind of thing you could lose in a coat pocket for months. 12 images. From Derek's phone. Sent by a 14-year-old girl who had seen something on her father's screen and decided without fully understanding what she was doing or what it might cost her that her grandfather needed to know. I took the drive to the spare bedroom and plugged it into the old laptop. The backup folder had 14 years of photographs organized by date, and at the very end, filed under the day of the backup, were 12 images with file names that were just strings of numbers. I opened the first one. It was a screenshot of a text conversation between Derek and a contact saved as CH. The messages were date-stamped March 3rd, 11 days before the mortgage instrument was filed. I read the first 3 lines and felt the floor of the world shift approximately 2 inches beneath my feet. I had almost everything I needed. Almost. Derek always liked coffee shops the way some men like podiums. They made him feel like he was performing competence for an audience which, in his line of work, was half the job. I had watched him do it at client meetings. He brought me too. Twice over the years, the way he'd arrive 5 minutes early. Get himself set up at the right table, order something complicated enough to signal that he knew what he was doing, and then lean back with his shoulders relaxed and his hands loose on the table, like a man who had already won whatever conversation was about to happen. I called him on a Monday morning and told him I wanted to talk before Christmas. Not about the lawsuit, not about the letter from his lawyer. I didn't mention either of those things. I told him I was tired, which was true, and that I thought maybe we could find a way through this that didn't involve lawyers and courtrooms, which was not true but was exactly what he needed to hear. He picked the coffee shop himself, a place called Riverside Grounds on the east side of Cedar Falls, half a mile from his old high school, close enough to his office in Des Moines that he could frame it as a reasonable drive. He got there before me and had already ordered when I came through the door, which told me he was comfortable, and that comfortable was exactly where I needed him to stay. I ordered a plain black coffee at the counter. In my chest pocket under my flannel shirt and my canvas jacket, I had my phone with the voice recorder app open and running. Iowa is a one-party consent state, which means that if you are a participant in a conversation, you are legally permitted to record that conversation without informing the other party. Arthur had confirmed this twice and had me write it down in my composition notebook so I would not second-guess myself in the moment. I was a participant. The recording was lawful. Derek stood when I came to the table, which surprised me. He shook my hand and held it a half-second longer than necessary, the way people do when they want to communicate sincerity without having earned it. He looked good, well-rested, the look of a man who had been sleeping fine. "Dad," he said, "I'm really glad you called." "Sit down, Derek," I said. I ordered coffee. I sat across from him and put both hands around my mug and looked at him the way I used to look at an engine I was trying to understand, not with hostility, just with attention. He talked for the first few minutes about the drive up, about Vanessa, about Sophie's grades, and I let him talk because a man who is talking is not thinking about what he's revealing. Then I set my mug down and said, "I need to understand the mortgage, Derek. Walk me through it from your side." He shifted in his chair. A small movement barely visible, the kind of micro-adjustment a person makes when a conversation moves from comfortable to something that requires management. Then he smiled, and the smile was the one I had seen at Labor Day, the one that was mostly calculation wearing the clothes of warmth. "Dad, look," he said. "I know this has been stressful. I know the bank call scared you. But here's the reality of the situation." He wrapped both hands around his own cup and leaned forward slightly, and his voice dropped into the register he used when he was explaining something he considered obvious. "The note is real where it counts. I needed to create a paper structure for some investment reallocation, and the cleanest way to do it was to put the property into the instrument temporarily. It was always going to come off. It was never meant to be permanent. But I never signed it," I said. I kept my voice level and confused the voice of a man who was struggling to understand rather than a man who understood everything perfectly. Derek waved his hand slightly. "Dad, you were there. You just don't remember it the way I do. That happens. It's fine. Walk me through what happens if I don't sign the transfer at Christmas," I said. He picked up his cup, took a drink, and set it down with the deliberateness of someone who is choosing their next words with some care, but not quite enough. "Then the note stays on the property, and the legal process runs its course. The bank, meaning the instrument, meaning me, has the right to pursue collection. That means the house, Dad. I don't want that. Nobody wants that. But the paper says what it says. And if I sign the transfer, then the note disappears that same night. I tear it up in front of you. You move forward, I move forward. The family moves forward. Nobody goes to court. Nobody pays lawyers." He paused, and then he said the sentence that I had driven 40 minutes and bought a $4 cup of coffee specifically to hear him say out loud. "Look, the signature on that document close enough is close enough for family purposes. Nobody's ever going to examine that paper again after Christmas. It just needs to exist on paper long enough to make the transfer happen clean. Close enough is close enough for family purposes." I picked up my mug and took a slow drink and did not let anything show on my face, which took more effort than I would like to admit. My jaw was so tight the back of my teeth ached. My free hand, the one below the table, was gripping my knee hard enough that I could feel it through my jeans. But my face stayed still, and my voice came out the same way it had gone in level tired, a little lost. "I'll think about it," I said. Derek relaxed back into his chair, with the ease of a man who believed he had just closed something. He ordered a second coffee. He told me a story about a client in Ames that I did not listen to. We shook hands at the door, and he walked to his car with his shoulders loose and his step easy, the walk of a man who had performed competence for an audience and believed the audience had bought it. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for 10 minutes, with the recorder still running, in case I wanted to add any notes while the conversation was fresh. I played back the last 40 seconds. His voice came through clear and unhurried, the way confident men speak when they are certain no one is keeping score. I drove home and called Arthur. Meg Tilson called Derek the following Monday. Meg Tilson had been writing for the Cedar Falls Gazette for 11 years, which was long enough to know that the most interesting stories in a small Iowa city were never the ones that announced themselves. They were the ones you found by paying attention to the small irregularities, the property records that didn't quite add up, the title company clerk who mentioned something offhand over lunch, the detail in a public filing that was just slightly too neat to be accidental. Sandra Pruitt had worked in the Black Hawk County title office for 16 years. She and Meg had known each other since their daughters played soccer on the same rec league team in 2019, and they had the kind of friendship that survives on occasional coffee and mutual discretion. Sandra did not gossip, but she had a finely calibrated sense of what constituted a matter of public record versus a matter of personal business, and a forged mortgage instrument filed with the county recorder fell squarely into the first category. She had not given Meg names. She had simply mentioned in the context of a conversation about unusual filings she had processed that year that there was a property on Sycamore Creek Road with what appeared to be a fraudulent instrument in the record, and that the property owner had come in personally to pull certified copies, and that the whole thing had the particular smell of a family dispute that was about to become something more formal. Meg pulled the public record herself the same afternoon. The instrument was right there in the county database, accessible to anyone with a computer and a reason to look. She cross-referenced the property address with the county assessor's records and found the owner of record Harold J. Bennett, purchased 2009, no encumbrances until March of the current year. She found the lender name on the instrument. She searched that name in the Iowa Secretary of State's business registry and found a financial advisory registration tied to a Des Moines address. She sent an email on a Monday morning. Polite 2 paragraphs identifying herself and the Gazette, asking if the recipient would be willing to comment on a property matter she was researching for a story on unusual real estate filings in Black Hawk County. She did not use the word fraud. She did not need to. I know all of this because Meg told me herself 3 weeks later when I finally agreed to meet her for coffee. But I am getting ahead of myself. What I knew at the time was only what I could observe from my side of it, which was this: Derek called me on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 days after Meg's email went out, and his voice had lost the loose, easy quality it had carried at Riverside Grounds. It was tighter now. Not panicked, not yet, but compressed the way a man's voice gets when he is managing something he hadn't accounted for. "Dad," he said, "I've been thinking. Let's do Christmas early this year. Just family. Maybe the 24th dinner at the farmhouse. Keep it simple." The farmhouse. His suggestion, not mine. He wanted the signing to happen in the house itself, which I suspected he found satisfying in some way I did not want to examine too closely. "That works," I said. "I'll cook." A short pause. "You sure we could bring things?" "I'll cook," I said again. "Come at 6. After I hung up, I sat for a moment and thought about the difference between the Derek who had leaned back in his chair at Riverside Grounds, with his shoulders loose and his second coffee in his hand, and the Derek who had just called me on a Tuesday afternoon to move up a dinner by 2 days. The difference was about 48 hours and one email from a reporter he had not expected. A man who rushes makes mistakes. I had seen it 1,000 times in the shop. The mechanics who worked fast were not always the ones who worked well. The ones who hurried were the ones who forgot to torque the last bolt, who cross-threaded a fitting because they were already thinking about the next job, who signed off on work. They hadn't fully checked because the pressure of the clock made caution feel like a luxury. Derek had been patient for 9 months. Meg Tilson had made him impatient in 48 hours. I called Arthur that same evening. "He moved the dinner up," I said. "Good," Arthur said without any particular surprise. "That means he's feeling pressure from somewhere. Pressure makes people skip steps." He paused. "Are you ready?" I looked at the kitchen drawer where the accordion folder sat, tabbed and ordered. Behind it, in the back of the drawer under the pot holders, sat 2 brown envelopes with Arthur's letterhead on the return address. The composition notebook was on the counter. My phone was charged to full the recording from Riverside Grounds, backed up in 3 separate places. Arthur's cell number was written on an index card in my breast pocket, next to Sophie's letter, which I had not moved since the morning I found it. "I've been ready since October," I said. Arthur told me the quiet title complaint had been filed with the Black Hawk County District Court on December 15th. It was alive in the court system, whether anything happened at Christmas dinner or not. The dinner was Derek's last opportunity to choose the easier version of what was coming. If he signed the settlement agreement, Arthur had prepared the lawsuit would resolve without a trial. If he didn't, the deputy would serve him papers on December 26th, regardless. "Either way," Arthur said, "the house is yours. The dinner just decides how ugly the path is." I spent the next 2 days cooking and preparing in parallel, which felt appropriate. Pot roast in the slow cooker for the 23rd. Groceries for the 24th. The good tablecloth Margaret had used for every Christmas since 1987 washed and pressed and laid out on the dining table with the leaf inserted to make room for 5 people. And in the kitchen drawer beneath the pot holders, the accordion folder and the 2 brown envelopes and everything I had spent 3 months collecting. I offered to host Christmas Eve at the farmhouse. Derek said yes before I finished the sentence. I spent the 23rd cooking like it was a real Christmas, because for one person in that house it would be. Sophie was coming. That was reason enough to make it real. I put the pot roast in the slow cooker at 7 in the morning with carrots and onions and the rosemary from the pot on the kitchen window, so that Margaret had started from a cutting in 2016 and that I had somehow kept alive through 4 Iowa winters through a combination of inattention and luck. I made the bread from scratch, which I had not done since the previous Christmas, and the smell of it filled the farmhouse by 10 o'clock, in a way that made the rooms feel occupied rather than just inhabited. I had things to do that had nothing to do with cooking, but I did the cooking first because it grounded me. 40 years of mechanical work had taught me that the best way to prepare for a complicated job was to do the simple jobs around it with full attention. You cleaned your tools before a difficult repair. You organized your workspace. You made sure the basics were right so that when the hard part came, your hands knew where everything was without your eyes having to look. The accordion folder was in the kitchen drawer beneath the pot holders, tabbed and ordered, the way Arthur and I had organized it together in his office the previous week. Behind it sat 2 brown envelopes with his firm's return address, each one labeled in his handwriting. My phone was on the counter, charged to 100%. The Riverside Grounds recording backed up to the cloud and to the USB drive Walt was keeping at his house as a second copy. Arthur's cell number was on an index card in my breast pocket next to Sophie's letter. At 2 in the afternoon, I went through every room in the farmhouse the way I go through a vehicle before a long drive, methodically, not looking for anything specific, just confirming that everything was where it should be. The dining room table had the good tablecloth on it, the white one with the embroidered edge that Margaret had bought at a craft fair in Dubuque in 2013. I had washed and pressed it the day before. The leaf was in making room for 5 place settings. I counted them twice. 5. Harold, Derek, Vanessa, Sophie, and Ray. I had not told Derek that Ray was coming. I had not lied about it either. Derek simply had not asked, and I had not volunteered the information, because a man preparing to pressure his father into signing away his home does not need advance warning about who else will be sitting at the table. Ray arrived at 4:15 in a blue Ford pickup that had seen better decades, but ran clean, which he attributed to the fact that he changed the oil himself every 3,000 miles, regardless of what the manufacturer recommended. He pulled up the gravel drive and parked beside the barn and climbed out with a duffel bag over one shoulder and a grocery bag in the other hand, and the slow, deliberate movement of a man whose replaced knee was still negotiating its terms with the rest of his body. I met him at the gate. We shook hands the way Bennett men shake hands, firm, brief, no performance to it. I was 72 years old and looked it honestly, with white hair gone thin on top, and the permanent squint of a man who had spent most of his life working outdoors. He handed me the grocery bag. "Pie," he said. "Pecan. From that place in Omaha you like. You drove 4 hours with a pecan pie in your truck." 4.5, he said. "Construction on 80 near Des Moines." He looked past me at the farmhouse, taking it in slowly, the way men take in places they have not seen in a while. Not the way a stranger looks at a building, but the way a person looks at a version of time. "Looks good, Harold. You've kept it up." "Trying to," I said. We went inside and I poured him coffee and he sat at the kitchen table and looked around the room without commenting on anything specific, which was how Ray communicated approval. He noticed the tablecloth and the 5-place settings and the drawer with the folder in it. And he did not ask about any of them, because Ray had driven 4.5 hours in December with a pecan pie, and he already knew everything he needed to know about why he was here. At 5 o'clock, Sophie arrived ahead of her parents. She came through the front door in her winter coat, and her backpack still on the way. Teenagers arrive. Places when they have mentally already separated themselves from the adults they came with. She stopped when she saw Ray at the kitchen table, and her face went through 3 expressions in under 2 seconds: surprise, recognition, and then something that settled into careful understanding. "Uncle Ray," she said. "Hey, kid." Ray lifted his coffee mug in her direction. "You got tall." "Everybody says that," she said, dropping her backpack by the door. Then she crossed the kitchen and hugged Ray around the shoulders, bending down slightly to do it, because she was nearly his height now, and Ray patted her arm twice with his big, weathered hand, the way he had patted my shoulder at my father's funeral 40 years ago. She straightened up and looked at me. Her eyes went to the kitchen drawer for just a fraction of a second, then back to my face. I nodded once. Just once. She let out a breath that she had been holding for longer than tonight, I suspected. Then she took off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door and asked if she could help set the table. "The forks go on the left," I told her. "Grandpa," she said, with the particular patience of a teenager correcting an adult, "I know which side the forks go on." "I know you do," I said. "I just like hearing you say it." We set the table together in the quiet kitchen, while Ray drank his coffee and the pot roast finished in the slow cooker, and the last of the December light left the windows. Outside, the gravel drive was empty. They arrived at 6, all of them smiling. For 2 hours, it was almost a family. Derek came through the front door with a bottle of red wine and a handshake that had recovered its looseness since the Tuesday phone call, which told me the 48 hours had been enough for him to talk himself back into confidence. Vanessa came in behind him in a green dress that was slightly too formal for a farmhouse dinner, which I understood was intentional. She had dressed for a signing, not a meal. She handed me a candle in a box with tissue paper around it and said it was for the house, and I thanked her and set it on the counter and did not light it because it was Margaret's counter, and Margaret had chosen the smells in this kitchen for 30 years, and I was not prepared to change them for Vanessa's candle on this particular evening. Sophie had set the table while Ray and I finished in the kitchen, and she had done it correctly, forks on the left water glasses above the knife, the way Margaret had taught her at this same table when Sophie was 7 years old and insisted on helping with everything. Ray had moved to the living room and installed himself in the green armchair. In the corner, my reading chair, which Vanessa had pushed behind the door in October, and which I had moved back to its proper position the morning after her guests left. He sat with his coffee and his replaced knee stretched out at an angle that suggested comfort, and he did not stand when Derek and Vanessa came in. He lifted his mug. "Derek," he said. "Uncle Ray." Derek's smile flickered for just a fraction of a second, the same flicker I had seen at Labor Day, the bad connection flicker, and then it restabilized. "Didn't know you were coming up." "Decided last minute," Ray said, which was not strictly true, but was true enough. We sat down to dinner at 6:15. The pot roast had been in the slow cooker for 11 hours, and it showed the meat came apart with a fork. The carrots had gone soft and sweet. The broth had reduced to something that tasted like every good winter meal I had ever eaten, compressed into a single spoonful. I watched Derek take his first bite and close his eyes for a half-second, the way he used to do as a boy, when something tasted exactly right. And for that half-second, I let myself feel what it cost to be sitting at this table doing what I was about to do. The dinner conversation moved, the way dinner conversation moves in families that are pretending nothing is wrong, covering ground that everyone has already covered, avoiding the territory everyone is actually thinking about. Derek talked about a client in Ames. Vanessa asked about Walt and whether he was still doing his own plumbing, which was an odd question to ask about a neighbor she had met twice, and I answered it straightforwardly, because odd questions asked in good faith deserve straight answers. Sophie talked about a history project on the Iowa caucuses that her teacher had assigned, and I asked her questions about it, because I was genuinely interested, and because watching Sophie talk about something she cared about was one of the better things available to me on any given evening. Ray said almost nothing for the entire first hour. He ate his pot roast, refilled his water glass himself when it was empty, and watched the table with the unhurried attention of a man who had driven 4.5 hours to observe something and was not going to waste the trip by talking through it. At 7:30, Sophie got up to help me clear the first course, and in the kitchen she stood close to me at the sink and said very quietly, without looking at me, "Are you okay, Grandpa?" I handed her a serving dish to dry. "I'm fine, Bug. You've been watching Dad's hands all night." She was right. I had been. Derek's hands were how I could tell where he was in his own head when they were loose and open on the table. He was comfortable when they were wrapped around his wine glass. He was managing something, and for the last 20 minutes they had been flat on the tablecloth on either side of his plate, which was the position they took when he had made a decision and was waiting for the moment to act on it. "Go sit with your Uncle Ray after dessert," I told her. "Whatever happens, stay with Ray." She looked at me then. Her jaw tightened the way Margaret's used to tighten when she had decided something and was not going to be talked out of it. "I'm not a little kid, Grandpa." "I know you're not," I said. "That's why I'm telling you instead of just sending you upstairs." She considered that for a moment. Then she dried the serving dish and carried it back to the dining room without another word, which was as close to agreement as a 14-year-old Bennett was going to get. We had dessert at 8. Ray's pecan pie, which was from a bakery on Dodge Street in Omaha that had been making the same recipe since 1974, and which was so good that even Vanessa had a second slice, and for a few minutes the table was quiet, in the way that tables get quiet when everyone is eating something that requires full attention. Then Derek set down his fork. He wiped his mouth with his napkin. He glanced at Vanessa, and Vanessa gave him the smallest nod I had ever seen a person give, barely a movement at all, more of a decision, communicated through stillness, and Derek reached down beside his chair and lifted a leather portfolio onto the table. He set it next to the serving dish, with a sound that was quieter than it should have been given what it contained. I unzipped it with both hands. The papers inside were laser-printed crisp, tabbed in 3 places with colored adhesive flags marking the signature lines. He straightened the stack once unnecessarily, then looked across the table at me with the expression of a man who believed he was doing something reasonable. "Dad," he said, "before it gets too late, let's get this sorted." He reached into the portfolio and produced a pen. A heavy one, the kind that costs more than a pen should cost. He placed it on the table with the tip pointing toward me. I looked at the pen. Then I looked at Derek. Then I looked at Sophie, who was looking at her plate, with her jaw set and her hands in her lap. I stood up. "Before anyone does anything tonight," I said, "I need to take care of something first." I walked to the living room doorway and crouched down to Sophie's eye level. "The upstairs TV has the Christmas movies on," I said quietly. "Take the rest of the pie with you." Sophie looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were very bright and very steady. Then she stood up, picked up her dessert plate, and walked to the stairs without looking at her father. Her footsteps went up and a door opened, and a door closed, and then the house was quiet, in a completely different way than it had been before. I went to the kitchen drawer and took out the accordion folder and the 2 brown envelopes and carried them back to the dining room table. Derek's smile started losing its structure. "Before I reveal the ultimate confrontation and the undeniable piece of evidence that broke this whole trap wide open, please type 'still here' or drop a 100 in the comments right now, so I know you're writing this story out with me. And a quick heads up, the rest of this story includes creative fictionalized elements designed for dramatic effect. If that's not your cup of tea, feel free to step away now. Otherwise, stay right here, because justice is about to be served." I set the accordion folder on the table next to Derek's leather portfolio. His folder had laser-printed tabs and adhesive flags. Mine had 40 years of habit and 14 years of documentation and the specific gravity of a man who had kept everything. I did not sit down. I stood at the head of my own table and opened the folder to the first tab and turned it to face them. "This is a certified copy of a mortgage instrument recorded against this property in March," I said. $120,000. I pulled it from the Black Hawk County Recorder's office myself. I turned to the next page. "And this is the signature on it. It's a careful signature. It is not mine. The capital H has no hook on the second stroke. I have written my name the same way since 1974. Whoever drew this studied it, but never watched my hand move." Derek's jaw tightened. "Dad, we've been over this." I turned to the next tab without raising my voice. "Chicago, March 14th. The day this instrument claims I appeared before a notary in Waterloo and signed it in his presence." I laid the documents flat. "Amtrak ticket, outbound Cedar Falls, March 12th. Hotel confirmation, North Michigan Avenue, 3 nights. 2 restaurant receipts, both date-stamped, both placing me in Chicago on the 14th. I was 250 miles away when my name was being signed in Black Hawk County." Vanessa set her wine glass down carefully. The sound of it was very precise in the quiet room. She had not spoken since I stood up from the table, and I did not expect her to speak now. She sat with her shoulders pulled slightly inward, the green dress that had been chosen for a signing, now looking like the wrong costume at the wrong event. And she watched her husband the way a person watches something they have invested heavily in and are beginning to understand was not a sound investment. "Gerald Moss," I continued, turning to the next tab, "has held a notary commission in this county for 22 years. He signed an affidavit 3 weeks ago stating that he stamped that acknowledgement block without ever meeting me without ever verifying my identity solely on your representation that everyone had already signed. He put that in writing to keep his license. I slid the affidavit across the table until it stopped in front of Derek's hands. He's never met me once in his life. Derek's hands were no longer flat on the tablecloth. They were gripping the edge of the table, knuckles gone pale and tight. The hands of a man holding on to the only solid surface available to him. I had seen hands grip things that way before in the shop, when a man was working on something that was about to slip, and he knew it and was not ready to let go. I reached the bank statements tab. 7 years printed and organized by year, each account on its own section, the numbers running clean and unambiguous down every page. I turned it to face them and let them look at it without comment for a moment, because some things do not require explanation. They require only time and attention. $120,000, I said finally. Not as a lump, not in installments, not in any form at any time in any account I have ever held. I set my hand flat on the page. You cannot forge the absence of money. Derek's mouth opened. He started to say something. I could see the shape of it forming the beginning of another explanation, another reframing. And then he stopped. Because he was a man who worked with numbers for a living, and the numbers on those pages said one thing only, and there was no reframing available for a thing that simply did not exist. Then I took my phone from my shirt pocket and laid it flat in the center of the table and pressed play. His own voice filled the dining room. Unhurried, caramel smooth, exactly as it had sounded at Riverside Grounds 2 weeks earlier, when he had leaned back in his chair with his second coffee and explained it all to me like I was slow. The signature on that document, close enough, is close enough for family purposes. Nobody's ever going to examine that paper again after Christmas. Just needs to exist on paper long enough to make the transfer happen clean. Derek came out of his chair. The chair went over backward and hit the floor, and the sound rolled through the farmhouse like a door slamming in an empty hallway, hard and final and impossible to take back. He was on his feet, with his finger pointing across the table, and his voice had climbed into a register. I had not heard from him since he was 17 years old, and caught in a lie about where he had been on a Friday night. You recorded me. The last word cracked high and unfamiliar, stripped of every layer of the managed, competent voice he had been using since Labor Day. You can't, that's illegal. Iowa, I said. My voice came out the same way. It had gone in level. Unhurried, the voice of a man who has been certain of this moment for 3 months and does not need to raise it to be heard. One-party consent. I was the one party. Your lawyer will explain it. You'll have one by Thursday. He stood there, breathing hard, one hand on the back of the overturned chair, the other braced against the table, and I watched the calculation attempt to restart in his face and fail again, the way an engine cranks without catching when the fuel line is empty. I set the last item on the table. 12 photographs, printed from the USB drive Walt had kept at his house as a second copy. Screenshots of text messages between Derek and a contact saved as CH dated March 3rd, 11 days before the instrument was filed with the county. I did not read them aloud. I did not need to. Derek looked at them, and the color left his face in a single even recession, the way heat leaves a metal surface when the source is cut and the cooling is simply a matter of time. Ray had not moved from his chair in the corner. He sat with his coffee mug resting on his knee and watched, and his presence in that corner was the quietest and most complete thing in the room. The presence of a man who has driven 4.5 hours to witness something and is witnessing it. Then Derek said the one thing I had not prepared for. I just wanted a chance, Dad. He said it quietly. Not the voice he had used at Riverside Grounds, not the managed voice of a man performing competence. This was something underneath all of that, thinner, younger, the voice of a boy who had grown into a man without fully resolving the distance between the two. He was still standing, one hand on the back of the overturned chair, and his face had the particular stripped quality of a face from which everything calculated has been removed, leaving only what was always there beneath it. I looked at my son for a long moment. 40 years of his life moved through my memory the way footage moves when you're looking for a specific frame. His first day of school with his lunchbox held in both hands. The way he used to fall asleep in the truck on long drives with his head against the window. The afternoon, I taught him to change oil in the driveway, and he got it on his shirt and laughed instead of being upset. All of it there. All of it real. A chance at what? I said. Derek's jaw worked. At not drowning. The debt, Dad. $160,000. I've been underwater for 2 years. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell anyone. I thought if I could just get the property into the instrument, temporarily buy some time, restructure. He stopped, pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment. I was going to fix it. I was going to put it all back. With what? I asked. Not harshly, just the question. He didn't answer, which was the only honest thing he'd said all evening, without meaning to. Vanessa had not spoken since the recording played. She sat with both hands in her lap, and her wineglass untouched, and her eyes on the tablecloth. And I understood that whatever she had imagined this evening becoming, it had not been this. She looked smaller than she had at 6 o'clock. The green dress that had been chosen for a signing now looked like a costume at the wrong event. I reached into the accordion folder and produced the 2 brown envelopes Arthur had prepared. I set them on the table between Derek's leather portfolio and my folder in the cleared space where the pecan pie had been an hour ago. 2 envelopes, I said. Envelope A is a settlement agreement. You sign a sworn confession, notarized, recordable, suitable for filing with the county, admitting that the mortgage instrument was fabricated, that the signature was not mine, and that Gerald Moss was misled into providing the notarization. You self-report to the Iowa Financial Regulatory Board within 30 days regarding the investment accounts. In exchange, I withdraw my damages claim and do not assist the district attorney in building a criminal case. I slid it 1 inch toward him. The instrument gets struck from the record. The house stays mine. We go our separate ways. Derek stared at the envelope. Envelope B, I continued, is a courtesy copy of the quiet title complaint filed with the Black Hawk County District Court on December 15th. It already exists. A deputy will serve you formally on December 26th, regardless of what happens tonight. Tonight only determines which version of what comes next you choose to participate in. The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving through the bare oak tree in the backyard with a low, persistent sound, the kind of sound that old farmhouses absorb and return as part of their own voice. Ray stood up from the green chair. He moved slowly the way he always moved, with the deliberate economy of a big man who had learned not to waste motion. He crossed the room, picked up envelope A, and held it out to Derek. "Sign it," Ray said. His voice had the same rocky, unhurried quality it had on the phone from Nebraska, the voice of a man who had driven 4.5 hours and was not going to waste the trip on ceremony. "Sign it, Derek, before this becomes something none of us can come back from." Derek looked at Ray. Then he looked at Vanessa, and Vanessa looked back at him, and something passed between them that I did not try to read because it was not mine to read. Then Derek looked at me. "Dad," he said, "I'm sorry. I had waited 9 months to hear those words. I had imagined what I would feel when they came. What I actually felt was something quieter and more complicated than I had anticipated. Not satisfaction, not relief, not the clean release that apologies are supposed to bring. More like the feeling you get when a long job is finally finished and you step back and look at it and understand that the work was real and the result is real and the cost of both of them is also real, and none of those things cancels out any of the others. "I know you are," I said. He picked up the pen. Not the heavy one he had brought, the one that cost more than a pen should cost, which was still lying on the table, with its tip pointed at the chair I had been sitting in. He picked up the pen from my side of this table, a plain ballpoint, the kind I kept in the kitchen drawer next to the notepad, and he signed the settlement agreement in 4 places, and his signature, I noticed, was shaky, in a way that mine had never been on any document, and it was the most honest thing his hand had ever put on paper. I photographed every signed page with my phone and sent the images to Arthur, who responded in under 2 minutes from wherever he was spending his Christmas Eve. Received. Well done, Harold. Get some sleep. Ray righted the overturned chair and set it back in its place without comment. Vanessa stood and began clearing the dessert plates, which was the most useful thing she had done in my house in 4 months. Derek sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on the settlement agreement, reading it again, the way people read things they have already signed, looking for the version of events in which they made a different choice. I went to the bottom of the stairs. "Sophie," I called up. "You can come down now." A door opened. Footsteps on the stairs. She appeared at the bottom with the empty pie plate in one hand and her socks mismatched in the way teenagers' socks are always mismatched. And she looked around the dining room and read the room the way smart 14-year-olds read rooms, which is to say completely and immediately. She looked at me. Her eyes were wet, but her chin was steady. Margaret's chin, the one that didn't move when it had decided something. "Is it done?" she asked. "It's done, Bug," I said. She walked to me and put her arms around my waist and pressed her face into my chest, the same way she had at Labor Day, and this time I did not have to step back to keep my footing. I had enough ground under me. We stood in the hallway of my house on my land, and outside the wind moved through the oak tree where Margaret's ashes had been resting for 4 years, and the house held us the way old houses hold the people who have earned the right to be inside them. The paperwork took 3 weeks. The quiet took longer. Derek and Vanessa left on Christmas morning before 8. I heard their car on the gravel before I was fully awake. The tires moving slowly, the way tires move when someone is trying not to be heard leaving. Ray was asleep in the guest room. Sophie was asleep on the couch under the quilt Margaret had made in 2017. The one with the blue and gold squares that Sophie had always claimed was her favorite, which I had always suspected was less about the quilt and more about what it represented: a grandmother's hands and a winter afternoon and the particular safety of being small in a house that felt permanent. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the sun come up over the east field, the same sunrise Margaret had watched from this same window for 11 years. The oak tree stood in the backyard with its bare branches against the pale sky, and the ground around it was hard with December frost, and everything was still and cold and exactly where it was supposed to be. Arthur called at 9:30. He had reviewed the signed settlement agreement the previous evening after my photographs came through, and had already drafted the consent judgment, a legal document that would be submitted to the Black Hawk County District Court for a judge's approval, formally incorporating the settlement terms into a court order. Once a judge signed the consent judgment, it would be filed with the county recorder, and the forged mortgage instrument would be struck from the public record. The county's own files would show one thing, and one thing only: the property at 4418 Sycamore Creek Road had been owned without encumbrance by Harold J. Bennett since 2009. How long for the judge to sign it? I asked. Given that both parties have agreed and the evidence package is what it is. Arthur said, I'd estimate 10 days to 2 weeks. I'll push for before the new year. He pushed. The Honorable Patricia Warren of the Black Hawk County District Court signed the consent judgment on December 30th. I know the date because Arthur called me at 4:17 in the afternoon and read me the operative paragraph over the phone, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who has done his job well and knows it and doesn't need to say so directly. The forged mortgage instrument was declared void. It was struck from the county record. The cloud on my title was removed. The property at 4418 Sycamore Creek Road, Cedar Falls, Iowa, belonged to Harold J. Bennett, free and clear, the same as it had for the past 16 years, the same as it would for however many years I had left to stand on it. I hung up and walked out to the backyard and stood under the oak tree for a while. I did not say anything. I just stood there with my hands in my jacket pockets and my breath making small clouds in the December air. And the oak tree stood above me, the way it always had, unbothered by any of it, the way trees are unbothered by the things that happen beneath them. Ray left for Nebraska on the 31st. He loaded his duffel bag into the blue Ford pickup and drove down the gravel drive without a long goodbye, which was how Bennett men did things, and which suited me fine. At the end of the drive, he stopped and rolled down the window and looked back at me standing at the gate. "You did right, Harold," he said. "I did what needed doing," I said. He nodded once and drove away. And I watched the truck until it turned onto the county road and disappeared, and then I went inside and made a fresh pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my composition notebook and wrote the last entry of the year. December 31st, 2025. Title cleared. House is mine. Ray went home. Sophie called at 7 to say goodnight. She had called every evening since Christmas. Short calls, 10-15 minutes, mostly about ordinary things, school and her history project, and a book she was reading for English class. But she called, which was the thing that mattered, and at the end of each call she said goodnight in a way that had more weight to it than the word usually carries the weight of someone who has learned that saying goodnight to the people you love is not a small thing and should not be treated as one. Derek filed his self-report with the Iowa Insurance Division in the second week of January per the terms of the settlement. Arthur confirmed receipt. The regulatory process would take months, and I did not follow it closely because the outcome of that process was not my circuit to trace. What I knew was that the settlement agreement had teeth in it, and that Arthur had made sure of that, and I trusted him to monitor what needed monitoring. Walt appeared at the fence on the second morning of the new year. The way Walt appeared at the fence most mornings with his coffee and his unhurried manner and no particular agenda. I told him the title had cleared. He nodded and looked out at the 4 acres for a moment, with the expression of a man confirming something he had not doubted but was glad to have confirmed. "Good," he said. That was all. It was enough. I started the new year by opening the spare bedroom that I had been using as a filing room and carrying the old laptop out to the recycling bin because it had served its purpose and I was done with it. I kept the USB drive. I kept the composition notebook. I kept the accordion folder in the kitchen drawer, not because I expected to need it, but because keeping records is what I do, and I saw no reason to stop. On the morning of January 3rd, 2026, Sophie's mother dropped her off at the farmhouse just after 10. Rachel was driving back through Cedar Falls on her way to Waterloo, anyway, she said, which I suspected was less true than it was kind. And Sophie came through the gate with her backpack and a bag of groceries she had picked up at the store on the way, which included, among other things, a box of the cocoa mix I kept in the cabinet, and a package of the sandwich bread I liked, and a small container of the rosemary salt that Margaret used to put on everything which I had not been able to find since Margaret's brand stopped being sold at the local grocery 2 years ago, and which Sophie had apparently tracked down online and ordered without mentioning it. She set the groceries on the counter and started putting them away in the right places, which told me she had paid attention to where things went, which told me she had been paying attention to a great many things for a long time. "I thought we could fix the fence today," she said, closing the cabinet door. "The north section. Walt said it's been leaning since October." "Walt's right," I said. "It's been leaning since September." She turned around and looked at me with her grandmother's eyes and her grandmother's expression, that particular combination of patience and certainty that Margaret had used on me for 30 years whenever I was being unnecessarily precise about something. "Do you want to fix it or not?" she asked. "I want to fix it," I said. I went to the garage and came back with 2 sets of work gloves and the post hole digger and the level and the bag of quick-set concrete and my father's old toolbox, the one with the red latches that had been sticking since 1987 and that I had never fixed because things that stick in familiar ways become a kind of landmark. I set it on the porch and opened it and took out the screwdriver yellow handle made in the USA. My father's before it was mine, and I put it in Sophie's hand. She turned it over and weighed it the way you weigh a real thing. Not a symbol, not a promise. A tool. "What's this for?" she asked. "The hinge on the gate is loose," I said. "Fix that first, then we'll do the posts." She looked at the screwdriver for a moment longer. Then she pulled on her work gloves and walked to the gate and crouched down and got to work. And I stood on the porch and watched her and felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for a long time. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to notice the way you notice when a vibration you have been living with finally stops, and the silence it leaves behind turns out to be a kind of relief you had forgotten was possible. I opened the toolbox and took out my composition notebook, which I kept there now instead of on the kitchen counter, and I wrote 2 entries on the first clean page. First repair of the new year. Gate hinge north fence 4418 Sycamore Creek Road. Her entry has a small star I drew next to her name because she is 14 and she drove 2 hours and bought rosemary salt, and she fixed the gate hinge on the first try without being shown how. Give it 30 years, and God help anyone who tries to put their name above hers on this land. I spent 68 years believing that if you worked hard enough and kept quiet long enough, the people who loved you would eventually see you clearly. I was wrong about that, and I am old enough now to say so without embarrassment. This is one of those grandpa stories that I never planned to tell. I kept it to myself for a long time because it involved people I loved and damage I did not fully understand how to describe. But Pastor Jim told me once that God doesn't need us to shout. He just needs us not to forget. So I wrote it down, and now you have it. If this family story taught me anything, it is this: a home is not just a property on a deed. It is the sum of every morning you rose before the sun to maintain it, every repair you made with your own hands, every grief you carried within its walls and refused to let break you. No signature, forged or otherwise, can transfer what a life has actually built. My personal opinion, for whatever it is worth, at 68, do not wait until someone is filing paperwork against you to have the hard conversation. I waited too long. I was too patient, too quiet, too willing to assume the best. Do not be like me in that regard. Speak sooner. Document everything. And never confuse someone's comfort with your own security. These grandpa stories do not always end cleanly. This one came close. And this family story, with all its paperwork and pecan pie and a 14-year-old girl who fixed a gate hinge on the first try, is the one I will carry longest. If something in this story stayed with you, leave a comment below and tell me what it was. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to be here for the next one, subscribe to the channel. The button is right there, and it costs you nothing but a second. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. It means more than I know how to say. One more thing before you go. The stories coming up on this channel include some fictionalized elements built for the purpose of exploring real human experiences. If that's not what you're looking for, no hard feelings. Step away and find the content that serves you best. But if you're the kind of person who stays for the whole story, I think you'll want to stay for what comes next.